The morning was quiet in Dogrudny until the sound of a sickening thud shattered the calm. Two small bodies fell from the 15th floor of a building, crashing to the pavement below. The impact was and the silence that followed was deafening. Neighbors rushed outside, their faces pale with shock. Some called for help, while others stood frozen, unable to comprehend what they had just witnessed. It wasn't until a woman, walking down the stairs, caught their attention as she moved slowly with cigarettes in her mouth. She is Galina Ryabkova, the mother of the two children now lying lifeless on the ground. She simply stood there, staring at her dead sons as people around her screamed in disbelief. One neighbor, still in shock, stepped forward and asked, "Are these your children?" Galina turned, her voice almost indifferent. "Yes," she said, her tone devoid of any emotion. "I threw them away." It was the confession of a mother who had just ended her children's lives, and yet she showed no sign of remorse. But the question is, what could lead a mother to do something so unimaginable? What could possibly push someone to such a breaking point, to a place where the lives of their own children seemed expendable? The answers, buried in the shadows of a fractured family, would soon come to light. But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. This video is created solely for educational and documentary purposes. It does not endorse, glorify, or condone any of the criminal actions or individuals described in this case. Viewer discretion is advised. In one of the high-rise buildings, the Ryabkova family lived on the 8th floor. To the outside world, they appeared like any other family, going through the motions of daily life. Sergei, a computer programmer, worked long hours, providing for his wife, Galina, and their two sons. Galina, a stay-at-home mother, spent her days with the boys' 7-year-old Ver and 4-year-old Rodion. Their apartment seemed like just another unit in the building, blending into the backdrop of the quiet suburb. But behind the closed door of that 8th-floor apartment, things were far from ordinary. The Ryabkovas' home from the outside appeared a typical place where a family should feel safe, loved, and secure. Yet something was deeply wrong. Galina, once an affectionate mother, was increasingly erratic and withdrawn. Sergei, though seemingly a steady provider, found himself constantly battling the emotional distance growing between him and his wife. He had become concerned about Galina's mental state because she had a history of mental instability, as she had even tried to harm herself before their wedding, and now it seemed like the emotional pressure was starting to take its toll on her, pulling the family apart bit by bit. Galina had become more isolated, sometimes locking the children in the apartment while she disappeared for hours. The apartment, once a place of comfort, now felt more like a construction site. Exposed wires, unfinished walls, and piles of dirty dishes were a constant reminder of the disorder in the house. So Galina woke up one morning, her mind clouded by a sense of exhaustion that had been building for months. Sergei, her husband, had been away on a business trip for several days, and their already strained relationship was now on the verge of collapse. The two were planning a divorce, a decision that only intensified the feelings of abandonment that Galina had been battling for so long. Sergei, however, suggested he should have custody of the children after the divorce, a proposal that Galina's parents also supported. She complained that Sergei had left her without any money, though he insisted that he had provided financial support, and she had also received help from her mother. During this vacation, their son Ver's birthday passed, but Sergei didn't call. When Galina reached out to ask why he hadn't wished their son a happy birthday, Sergei responded that there was no point in congratulating a child who couldn't read or write. Just days before this incident, Sergei had struggled to reach his family, as no one was answering his calls. This lack of communication caused him considerable worry, and this was the backdrop of June 24, 2012, the day everything would change. Galina's mind was consumed by dark thoughts, a mixture of fear, anger, and hopelessness. She didn't want to live anymore, but the idea of leaving her children behind haunted her. She felt responsible for them, but also utterly trapped by the demands of motherhood. At some point that morning, she decided she was going to end all her pain, her family, and tragically, her children's lives as well. In the bathroom, she filled the bathtub and carefully placed her children's toy boats inside. And as they played, she brought out a hairdryer, intending to electrocute them all. She stood there, holding the plugged-in hairdryer, but the fuse blew. She went to the corridor to change the fuse and tried again, determined to carry out her plan, but the same result, but the fuse blew once more. Frustrated, confused, and desperate, Galina realized that she couldn't die that way. The attempt had failed, and the thoughts in her head only grew darker. Her next step was clear. If she couldn't die, then her children had to go first. Since she couldn't escape the overwhelming weight of motherhood, then this was the only way out. Galina made her way to the 15th floor of their building, bringing Ver and Rodion along with her under the pretense of playing. She told them they were going to throw paper airplanes off the balcony, a simple, innocent activity that hid her true intent. The boys, excited and unaware of what was about to unfold, followed their mother up the stairs, and when they reached the balcony, they stood there, innocently not knowing their lives were about to be stolen in the most brutal way. Rodion, only 4 years old, was the first to fall. Galina grabbed him, her hands firm as she flung him over the railing. The sickening sound of his body hitting the pavement below echoed through the quiet neighborhood. Then, it was Ver's turn. The 7-year-old, sensing something was wrong, began to scream and begged for his life, crying out for help, pleading with his mother. Galina, however, did not falter. She looked at her son, her expression blank, and told him, "It has to be this way. Forgive me." And then, without hesitation, she threw him over the balcony as well. His final cries were drowned out by the thud of his body hitting the ground. Galina stood there for a moment, as if nothing had happened, her gaze fixed on the bodies below. And then she simply sat down on the balcony railing, dangling her legs as she watched the chaos unfold around her. Then she walked calmly downstairs, as if she had just taken a casual stroll, and when she reached the ground floor, she grabbed a cigarette from her pocket, lit it, and stood outside, inhaling deeply. The neighbors began to gather around the lifeless bodies of her children, shocked and confused. They saw her standing there, staring at the ground as paramedics rushed to the scene. The horror of the situation set in, and Galina, standing among the gathering crowd, showed no emotion. She was asked if the children were hers, and in a tone that was strangely detached, she replied, "Yes, I threw them away." The coldness of her words left those who heard it in stunned silence. It was an admission that sent a chill through everyone who heard it. The police arrived shortly after, but Galina didn't make any attempt to flee. Instead, she stood still, almost waiting for them, and when the officers approached, she shouted at them, "What? Do you want to shoot me?" Then they asked her what had happened. "I was fed up with my children," she said. The officers were stunned, but they quickly took her into custody. At the police station, the interrogation began. The officers noted her calm demeanor, her complete lack of panic, as they asked her to explain her actions. Galina didn't waver, and she spoke plainly, even when detailing the horrific steps she had taken earlier that morning. She explained that, after failing to kill herself, she had decided the only solution was to get rid of her children, as they would be left without anyone to care for them if she was gone. "I had no reason to live without them," she said. "No one needed me anymore. No one cared." It was a declaration that spoke more to her mental state than any possible remorse for her action, and she wasn't trying to justify what she had done. She was simply explaining it, as though it were something that made sense to her, a necessary step in her own twisted reasoning. As the hours passed and the police gathered more information, it became clear that this was a crime not of sudden passion, but of deep, unaddressed psychological distress. The first step in the investigation was to gather accounts from witnesses and neighbors, anyone who might have seen or heard something that could shed light on the incident. What emerged from these interviews painted a clearer, more disturbing picture of the moments leading up to the deaths. Several neighbors recounted hearing the sickening thud of the bodies hitting the ground, their horror growing as they rushed outside to witness the aftermath. They spoke about the chilling calmness in Galina's demeanor as she stood near her children's bodies, and it was clear to them that this wasn't the reaction of a mother in shock. It was something else entirely. The police, now with a clearer understanding of the sequence of events, turned their attention to Galina's mental state. What was the true motivation behind her actions? Was this the act of someone who had lost control, or was there something more to it? To answer these questions, Galina was taken to the Serbsky State Scientific Center for Social and Forensic Psychiatry, one of Russia's most prominent institutions for evaluating criminal responsibility. The experts there were tasked with determining her mental state at the time of the killings. Could she truly understand the consequences of her actions, or had she been driven by any psychological condition? The evaluation took days, But when the results came in, they confirmed what many had feared. Galina was diagnosed with an acute mental condition, and doctors concluded that, at the time of the killings, she was incapable of comprehending the nature or consequences of her actions. In essence, Galina had been suffering from severe psychological distress, which had left her unable to understand the gravity of what she had done. This diagnosis raised the stakes of the case dramatically. Galina was no longer simply a mother who had committed a terrible crime. She was someone with a serious mental illness that had played a significant role in the tragedy. The law, however, had a clear stance on such cases. Under Russian criminal law, someone who was legally insane at the time of committing a crime could not be held criminally responsible. As a result, Galina was not criminally responsible for the deaths of her children. The investigation, while thorough, only raised more unsettling questions. The police were left to piece together a story of mental illness, emotional breakdown, and missed opportunities for intervention. The court's decision immediately sparked heated debate. In the days that followed, news outlets, social media, and public forums were filled with opinions, some in favor of the ruling, others in outright opposition. Many believed the court had acted justly, recognizing the severity of Galina's mental illness and the need for psychiatric treatment rather than prison. However, others were less convinced. Some felt that justice had not been served. They believed that Galina's crime was deliberate and warranted imprisonment. The debate extended far beyond the courtroom. People argued about the role of mental illness in criminal responsibility and whether the law was truly serving its purpose if it let someone like Galina off with what some viewed as an easier sentence. These questions lingered, unresolved, as the case continued to stir emotions across the country. For Sergei, the verdict was nothing short of devastating. He had already lost everything: the love of his life, his 2 children, and the future he had once imagined for his family. But the court's decision to sentence Galina to psychiatric treatment instead of prison only deepened his pain. In the months that followed, Sergei's grief turned to anger. He said he'd never forgive her, and that killing their children was something he can't forget. He said no apology would ever change that, and as soon as she recovered, he would divorce her. In the days that followed, the community came together, united in their sorrow, as they tried to make sense of the horrific loss that had torn through their neighborhood. The memory of Ver and Rodion was far from fading. It was embedded in the hearts of those who had witnessed the aftermath, and those who would forever carry the weight of that morning. A quiet memorial began to form on the very building where the children had fallen. On the walls of the apartment block, in delicate chalk and permanent marker, they wrote the names of the 2 boys, Ver and Rodion, side by side. It was a simple, yet deeply powerful tribute, a reminder that these children had once lived, had once played, and had once filled the halls of the building with innocent laughter. Their names, etched in plain sight for all to see, became a symbol of the collective grief that the community could not shake. The legacy of the Galina Ryabkova case would be one of loss, but also a stark reminder of the shortcomings in society's response to mental illness and child welfare. Galina's breakdown, while tragic, could have been prevented or at least mitigated if there had been more awareness, more intervention, more compassion for the signs of mental health distress that often go unnoticed until it's too late. For many, the biggest question remains: what more could have been done? Could a timely intervention have saved Ver and Rodion? Could Galina's suffering have been addressed before it reached a breaking point? The truth is, we may never know. The tragedy of their deaths is compounded by the haunting thought that it might have been avoidable. So what do you think? What sides of the debate are you on? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep this conversation going. Your insights could help make a difference. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.